So, welcome everybody to this bonus session for the book club sessions for the First Aid for Feelings manual. We're just starting the recording for this event today. We're sharing it as a sort of standalone recording, both for those who haven't been able to join us for the previous 5 sessions of the First Aid for Feelings manual book club, but also for those who maybe just want to look at this particular feeling, how to support the feeling of self-love. So, to tell you a bit about today, we'll start with housekeeping. We'll start with check-in and observations. But what we're going to do then, we're going to pause the recording because we're going to do some of those questions and observations here in the live event. And we'll do that off camera to honor confidentiality so we can have quite a gentle and open conversation and get really into what's going on for people. We will then activate the recording again and then go through that kind of self-love, and which is the focus of today's session. And we'll draw together all the different tools, tips, and techniques from the First Aid for Feelings manual to talk about self-love, why it matters, how it feels, and how to cultivate it. And then there are the observations and next steps, which apply to the book club only, really, where we, the live event only, where we look at sort of scoring where you are now compared to where you were at the start of the book club sessions 6 weeks ago. So let's go into the housekeeping and what to expect. So there is the welcome. We'll have this check-in that we're doing now, and then what we're going to do off camera in a minute. There'll be about 20-minute teaching, and then we'll have the open Q&A, which won't be recorded, so that we can have a conversation that's sort of confidential. As always, mute's muted and unmuted on invitation. As always, please put your questions in the chat or say hello in the chat, or if something resonates with you, we'd love to hear what your thoughts are or your input or ideas, or maybe what works for you or doesn't work for you. So we will gather those and bring them into the Q&A at the end. And then in terms of accessing the recording for the book club session, this one will be available on our YouTube channel. And so you will have a different link. The previous ones for this book club series have been on our server, whereas we're putting this one on the YouTube channel itself. So just a note for you to note that you're going into YouTube rather than going into our server for that. And for all of you, because I know there's quite a few of you who haven't been able to join us, but have been watching the recordings, you will all have a free 20-minute tune-up 3 weeks after today. So that's the first week of March. And we will, Zoe and I will be in touch to offer you your tune-up times. And we can then, make sure that you get your questions answered and supported. Because one of our commitments is to help make change sustainable. That this isn't kind of a course that you do and then, it's a good idea, and 3 days later, you're back into the old habits, life is still happening, and you've kind of lost that connection. So it's very deliberate that it's 3 weeks after, 21 days after you finish the book club, to help you just kind of get back on track if you've drifted a bit, but also to troubleshoot, particularly more helpful choices, which is often a hard thing to figure out if you're doing it for the first time. And then, of course, today's focus, which is self-love. So the check-in questions, as always, we look at how has the week been, observations, what have you noticed about your ability to access feelings, particularly feelings like self-compassion, which we were talking about last week. And what have you noticed about creating your first aid kit for feelings? Have you struggled? Has it been easy? Do you know where you're going to put it? Then remember that principle of insight in mind. If you put it somewhere in a drawer, you're not going to be remembering it. You're not going to be able to access it, because when you need it, remember that's the time when your brain isn't able to remember good ideas. So having it somewhere where it's inside means that it's easier to have it in mind. And then kind of pulling this all together. How is this showing up in your day? What difference can you notice between now and when you started? And then, as always, that curiosity, is there a particular feeling that you've noticed that you do a lot, either because it's very intense or because it's there a lot of the time, or some sort of combination of the two? That kind of starting with the feeling that's showing up the most, to really care for that, can be a good place to care for. So we're now going to go into pausing recording. In a minute, I'm going to ask Zoe to pause. What we're going to be talking about are those observational questions we've just shared. So if you're watching this at home after the event, do take this time to maybe check in with your answers to those questions. So if you could pause now, please, Zoe. So, welcome back, everybody. So, we've now had a short break talking about a few questions that have come up in response to there's observations for this last week about self-compassion, particularly self-compassion we talked about, and maybe also first aid stuff to support that. We were talking about having self-compassion, for example, if we are struggling with mistakes that we perceive as mistakes that we've done in the past, or if we're needing to be hyper vigilant for whatever reason, historical or past, some of those obstacles that sort of block us from being able to access self-compassion. And later on in the slides, I will talk about the difference between self-compassion and self-love, because that some people find that difficult differentiating. And I remember I found it difficult to understand the difference. So we'll give that a bit of time in a minute. But let's get going with the teaching for today's bonus session, which is self-love. So the first point that we talk about in the first step of feelings manual is why bother, which is a really important question. Some people think it's a very negative question, but why bother understanding and cultivating self-love? So really have a think for yourself. What would be your why bother? Why bother looking into self-love and strengthening it, cultivating it, like watering the seeds of it? And notice in the graphic, we have why bother with an exclamation mark and we have a why bother with a question mark. Why bother? It's like, oh, why bother? It's kind of that resignation, let's just move on, which kind of means not bothering. It's actually, why bother? It's like, oh, I wonder, what would be a good reason to bother to look at this? Is that kind of query, curiosity, which then leads you to the light bulb, leads you to the insight. So for me, the reason I want to cultivate and nourish and sustain my self-love, first of all, it's just like I'm so much happier. Me and myself and I just have so much more fun with that now that, self-love really is my foundation and my base in terms of my relationship with myself. But also with self-love, I'm able to care for the different aspects of my needs, whether that's physical, mental, social needs, spiritual needs, much better. And when I'm able to love myself with that clarity and sort of strength and sturdiness, my ability to form healthy, functional, sustainable relationship is so much better. It's not like I always get it right. I'm definitely not graduated yet, but that I'm much more able to form those really loving, nourishing relationships with others. So not only am I feeling better in myself on all these different practical, social, mental, physical, spiritual, even financial, and sort of getting on top of life's admin like car insurance or whatever, that is much less effort for me now because I see it all as part of caring for myself, just like my laundry. And then the added bonus is that actually, because of that sturdiness of my self-love, the relationship I've formed in the last sort of 10, 15 years tend to be a lot more robust and stronger than the ones I formed when I was younger or earlier. So it's very interesting to look at relationships that I have with my family of origin or people I've known since childhood. I can still feel that there are some remnants there in these older relationships where I'm not as sturdy in them as I am in the more recently formed relationships. So it might be interesting for you to reflect on how that shows up for you and if that's something that you can relate to. Then why do you need self-love? So I've talked about the feelings of information. And so what's the information from the feeling of self-love, which is a curious one, isn't it? What is happening when I feel self-love? And as far as I understand in my experience, the way I've done in my work is that when I'm able to feel self-love, that's actually when my needs are in alignment. My needs are being met, where I know when I'm not able to meet them, and I understand the reasons for why that's not possible in that moment. So, by the other way around, if I'm not able to feel self-love, then the information is there is something there that's out of alignment. There's some needs there that are not being met in whatever way, and I'm not aware of why. So I don't have the conscious choice of being with an unmet need. So it's tripping me up and blocking my access to self-love. I also want to remember, the culturality piece we talked about last week. So in cultures where we're not been educated from like day dot about self-love, how we do it, how we know how it feels, and how to sustain it. Many of us are learning this in adulthood, and there are a lot of cultural sort of handbrakes, so there are a lot of cultural sort of obstacles in the way that sort of block our access to self-love. And that can be like self-love is selfish. It can be like if we have self-love, we're lazy. If we have self-love, we are not interested in other people. So lots of beliefs. So remember that kind of belief piece we did, I think in week 2 or 3. Really get curious about what are your beliefs about self-love. Then that kind of the spectrum between blockers and engulfers. So some of us are more likely to block and avoid feelings. Some of us are more likely to get engulfed and kind of really caught up in our feelings. Um, and some of us are somewhere in between, sometimes more over here and sometimes more over there. And recognizing that regardless of which one is your kind of default, regardless of which one you tend to go to, that in itself is information. So you might, if you are an engulfer, you might want to bring in aspects that help you get more into your rational mind. So not so much in the feelings. And if you're a blocker, you might actually put things in place that connect you with your feelings. So if you think about, I often talk about it like a compass. If you only have north south or you only have east west, you're going to get lost. You need both. Or if you're trying to row a boat with one oar, if you only do feelings or you only do thoughts, you're going to end up, I mean, you might make some progress, but it's going to be a lot of effort on a single oar. Whereas if you have both, you make much stronger strides and you're able to go forward in a much more consistent fashion, actually towards the way you want to go. Then, in terms of the feeling of self-love and your triangle, so we're talking about triangulation, I think in chapter 1 or 2. So the triangle of time, task, and resources, actually factoring in self-love. Like anybody who's been in a long-term relationship, whether that's with a friend or a partner, if you take yourself and each other for granted and you don't go on dates, you don't make time to meet up, the relationship is going to suffer. Same applies to your self relationship. So unless you actually bring in your self relationship and you factor that into your triangle, into your day, then your self, that's even if you're able to access that self-love, you're going to struggle to sustain it. And somebody, I saw a post the other day, somebody was talking about having, like you see on nutritional ingredients, the minimum daily requirement. I can't remember where I found it. It was such a brilliant post. Because I think is what are your minimum daily requirement for self-love? And I know what mine are, to what's the absolute baseline I need to make sure, it's like the minimum amount of oxygen I can live with, for the day. So getting a sense of, well, where can you start? What can you bring in as some expression of self-love in your day? And even I was working with somebody the other day, one of her happy places is to make salad with lots of different colors, lots of herbs and seeds. And she just lit up. She's an artist, and she was really seeing all the images of the different colors and the flavors. And then when I asked her, so what about the salad bowl? Do you have any lovely salad bowls? And her face fell. She realized she's got some secondhand from a relative, or, she didn't actually have a beautiful bowl or beautiful, it's not salad cutlery, is it? No, it'll be something. There's two things you put into the salad bowl to scoop out the salad. And she was just using whatever was to hand. So for her Valentine's present this year, which is because we spoke yesterday, her Valentine's present this year is a beautiful salad bowl and beautiful salad thingies. And we were so happy about it together. And notice that it's such a small thing, but to take the time to find it, to go and buy it, and then make the time to buy the ingredients for the most beautiful salad, and then make the salad, savor it, really enjoy it. And she's going to take a photo of it and put that photo in her first aid kit. Yeah, it's a really good example of how we can join the dots with that. So think about where do you actually make time for your self-relationship and nurturing your self-love, so that so it's not just a good idea, but actually something that will be with you from now on. So then let's look at what you're doing now. So often using the scale of 0 to 10 is really helpful. So what's your current access to self-love using the scale of 0 to 10? Yeah. Are you able to access it all the time? So it's 10 out of 10. Are you able to access never? So that's 0 out of 10. So I really encourage you to actually write that number down and maybe put a date on it, 12th of February 2025. Access to self-love, 3.5 out of 10, or whatever it is. So you really kind of make a sort of a note, because I would imagine if you're watching this video or you're here in person, I'm imagining you want to strengthen it. That's probably one of the reasons you're here. So having that kind of baseline reading can be helpful for you to reflect on then when, when we speak for your tune-ups in 3 weeks' time, or, maybe at the end of the year or something, to come back, well, what is it now? And you may find that it goes up to 5, and then it goes up to 7, and then it goes up to, 8 or 9 or 10, and really feeling that journey. And then that question, well, if you didn't, what would you feel? What would you not know if you didn't have this feeling? So if you didn't have any self-love, what would you be missing out on? And that what if you didn't feel any self-love? It's missing the word feel there. So if you could make a note of that for me. Um, yes, if you didn't feel any self-love, what's likely to happen? So I can imagine actually if you didn't feel any self-love, you'd probably start to see the effects pretty quick. Yeah, there'll be some deterioration, and you may see already for yourself, now you're learning a bit more about it, how certain aspects of yourself haven't been cared for yet. Notice the word yet, because of not having more access to self-love. So I share in the first Fatal Feelings manual that for me, when I really started to look at my self-relationship, I recognized that actually the number one observation was one of neglect. I was neglecting myself. And that was across all domains: physical, mental, social, spiritual, nutritional, financial, name it. There was neglect there. So it was really sobering for me because I sort of had quite a bit of ego, very proud of, being this or that kind of person, particularly about being very intellectual and being very kind of quote unquote clever. And then I was like, not clever at all. This is not clever. And so that kind of recognizing that actually we need that self-love in order to have vibrant, sturdy and loving relationship with self and others. And then, of course, checking with yourself, is self-love helpful? Obviously, my answer is going to be yes. But I always invite that curiosity. If there's a part of you that believes it's not helpful, don't dismiss that. I always welcome, yeah, but. Those are obstacles, those are objections. Listen to your objection, what comes through it. And then in terms of that graphic, which is the feeling profile, uh, check those questions. Where do you struggle? Where do you struggle with self-love? Is that around particular people? How do you feel it in your body? What lets you know you're not able to feel that? Yeah, so you really do that exercise from the manual, and you can download the exercise file from the website. By the way, if you don't want to write in the book, you can download the exercise file and just do it on paper, or if you've got Adobe, you can do it on the computer. And then if we go on to then, actually, we're talking a lot about self-love, but do you actually know what that feeling feels like? And if I speak for myself, I didn't know what self-love actually felt like. I had no reference for it when I started this work. So if you don't know what it feels like, you're in good company. You may have some of you may have some sense of it, but not much. Or you may sometimes be able to access a bit of it, but not be able to hold it for very long. So if you look at the feeling chart on page 30, so we haven't covered the feeling chart in the slides. The feeling chart is basically about posture, words or thoughts, tone of voice, emotion, sensations in the body, and where you're placing your focus, whether it's past, present, or future. So I really invite you to sort of actually get that recipe, that chart of the feeling of self-love. So you start to get a sense of what are the components of self-love, because self-love has got a shape. If I'm doing like this, I'm not able to access my self-love because I'm all kind of braced. There's some threat coming. If I soften my shoulders, I soften my breath, particularly if I smile at myself, it's much easier for me to access my self-love. And then if my language, I say, hey, sweetheart, how are you doing? And so the words, the tone of voice, and in terms of the time, the focus in terms of past, present, or future, keeping it in the present. Not about whether I was able to love myself in the past or not, or whether I'll be able to love myself in the future or not, just in this moment. Can I really cultivate? Can I open my access to feeling of self-love? So I would really encourage you to do that feeling chart on page 30. And then, like we can see in the graphic there, the exercise here, the profile that you see on the slide, is that what lets you know when you can't access it. So that could be one of your dashboard indicators. We'll talk about the dashboard in a minute. So the ABC technique, so I won't go into that in a lot of detail here because we covered that in a number of different videos, but it's that becoming aware, for example, that you're being very hard on yourself, you're being very critical of yourself. or that you're feeling unsafe, or you're feeling not trusting, or whatever it is that lets you know, going, this is the feeling I'm feeling. Coming to your breath, whether it's the 3-5-7 breathing technique or it's the 4x4x4 technique, all in the book. And that kind of really giving yourself time to do them, follow them through. Come to your body. Hello, my dear body. Hello. Okay, how are we doing? Maybe move it. Maybe if you've got a lot of adrenaline in your body, you might need to stroke down from the shoulder down to the fingertips. You might need to walk up and down some stairs if you're able to do that activity, or do something that involves the body in whatever way to help just connect you, because the breath and the body are always in the present moment. You cannot catch up on breath from last week, and you certainly cannot stash away from breath till, for next week. I know some of you heard me say this so many times, but it's true. And then the choice, the more helpful choice. Remember, it can take a while to build up a stock of good, helpful choices. And if it's very new to you, start by doing the helpful choice, the APT technique, after the event. So not when you're in the heat of the moment, but afterwards, when you can maybe put the kettle on, have something nice to drink, sit down and work your way through the stages. Yeah. Because, yeah, if you're trying to do it in the moment and the stress intensity is really high, guess what? If you don't remember this or haven't seen it before, your access to your ability to think goes down. Yeah, that is really, really important. And not only to think, but also your access to self-love, which is the key message here in today's session. Because remember, the top scoop, this is the part of us that can really see the bigger picture. I can feel love for myself and others. I can have sense of that really sort of open, spacious feeling of connectedness with myself, with others, with life. Yeah. That's when all of my scoops are in alignment and I've got enough resources, brain power to access that frontal lobe, that part of my brain. Stress has gone up a little bit, so my ability to access self-love and think goes down a little bit. I still got access to my group scope, so I can feel love for myself when I'm around certain people, when I feel like I'm with my tribe, when I'm with my group. But when the stress goes all the way up, I go all the way down into my crocodile, I'm not safe, and that must mean I'm not worthy of love, or it's not safe to feel love. Yeah. So if you're in crocodile state, it's unrealistic to expect you to be able to think through more helpful choices or even do the ABC technique when it's really intense, which is why having that break, and actually one of the least recent posts are on social media, are a blog about Britain's greatest contribution to psychology is the habit of putting the kettle on. And I think I may have mentioned this before. In Britain, if you're not local, you're not been in Britain for lived here for a while, here in the UK, good news, bad news, no news, put the kettle on. And what it does, it creates just this bumper space. It takes about 2 minutes to boil the kettle, and then you find the mug or the cup and saucer and the tea and the milk. And so all of this kind of doing creates a bit of space for people to arrive, come together, settle down a little bit, connect. It's really powerful. And I don't know if anybody, ever has done a study about it, but I really do. I personally believe this is Britain's greatest contribution, with hands down, to anybody's psychological welfare and well-being. So once you've had that cup of tea, coffee, whatever it is, then you're much more able to slow things down, soften your breathing, so you get more of your brain back online, and therefore you can access your self-love. So I really want to remind you, particularly for those of you who are working through trauma, that in itself can sort of make it more difficult to access self-love. So then if we look at coming to your dashboard indicator. So we talked about these dashboard indicators, which is that, speed, fuel, water, and the rev count, so the effort. But underneath, if you've ever been in a car, you will see that there are the customizable, there are the kind of oil, temperature, engine, whatever, they're these customizable dashboard indicators. And I would really encourage you to identify what lets you know that your self-love is in the green, or it's in the amber, or it's in the red. And red would mean no access to self-love. Amber is kind of sort of a bit flickering, like a bad Wi-Fi connection. Green is like sturdy, good signal, good access to self-love. So have a think about what that is. I think for me, for self-love, it tends to be, when I go into inner critic, in a way that isn't constructive, because inner critic often alerts me to risks. And I'm like, thank you, inner critic. Really appreciate that because at heart, I think the inner critic is a risk manager. But when the inner critic goes into kind of judgmental language, or tells me I'm not safe, as somebody who's recovered from various traumas, there are still some remaining situations where I feel less safe. I feel much more safe than I ever used to before, but there are still where I'm still not fully safe or don't feel fully safe. Um, and so that often is also for me an indicator that I'm not able to access my self-love in that moment. So that for me, are mine. But have a think about what they might be for you. So, when we come to the choice chapter, there's a whole chapter on choice in the manual for a very good reason. It can be difficult to actually start to learn the skill of creating choices, to think of choices. How do I do them? In terms of self-love, I'm choosing here the focus of rejection. And I'm using rejection a really broad. Any kind of rejection equals harm. Yeah, so that's harm. That could be physical, mental, social harm, spiritual harm, any kind of harm. So it could be a rejection, just somebody says, they don't like you, or it could be somebody who kind of attacks you. So I'm putting all of that under the banner of rejection, which is often the thing that really sort of blunts or blocks our ability to self-love. And I'm putting it here in the cats, dogs, wolves, and tigers model. So that is in the manual as well. Remember, cats is minimal risk of serious harm. Dogs is low risk, but you would have a look to see if the dog is foaming at the mouth or is it sort of growling. Wolves, medium risk. You certainly wouldn't want to engage with wolves without some proper guidance. And then tigers is high risk. So you would make absolutely sure that you know what you're doing before you engage with those kind of situations because that is then again affecting your ability to access that self-love. And that's where we think about that kind of the second layer, the thoughts and feelings about the thoughts and feelings. So I may want to feel self-love, but I feel unable to feel it because of any one of those, for example. And so remember, reacting where is when the crocodile scoop only is active. You have no access or little access to self-love. Actually, if you could, Zoe, give me a note to put no or little access to self-love. Because we can sometimes have some, but it's just not strong enough for us to be able to get any sort of firm footing on it. And then responding, so being able to not do a knee-jerk reaction, to make maybe a little bit more skillful choices. If when all scoops are aligned enough, so notice that I put in the word enough there. They don't have to be fully aligned, we don't have to be fully calm and sturdy and sort of relaxed. It's just some of them. So it's full, some or full access to self-love. And you may not have thought about self-love in this duality of self-love versus rejection, but see what it feels like for you to stay with that, and what do you notice about that? How, what thoughts come up for you, and write them down, and maybe check out some of the Sherlockian questions, or the ABC, or some of those aspects that we talk about in the manual. And on that note, Sherlockian questions. So the 7 Sherlockian questions are there. And remember, we do that kind of mind map or map making to really check through self-love, what blocks self-love, how do you know you feel it? And those kind of questions, particularly, is it familiar? Is it familiar to you to not be able to feel self-love? And then I imagine that it may be appropriate, although I would question that, but it certainly wouldn't be proportionate. And I would imagine when it comes to the feeling of self-love, there will almost certainly be a historical component to it. It may not be necessarily sort of big T trauma, and we talked about that in that session. It might be lowercase t trauma. So there's kind of, but trauma is trauma, whether it's commonly or culturally perceived as trauma or not. When it's a trauma to our experience, the trauma will manifest in the body, and the bracing and everything will happen in the body, regardless of how other people perceive it. So really giving yourself that permission to not question your own experience of trauma. Just because somebody else didn't experience that as trauma doesn't mean that your trauma isn't real. It's like people who have come out of, airplane accidents or train accidents or, big natural disasters. And for some people, it's hugely traumatic, but for others, it's not. So really coming back to the sort of the truth of your own experience there. So I said earlier, I was going to talk about the difference between self-compassion and self-love, and that kind of how do parts affect access to self-love. So we got there the inner critic kind of pointing down at you, the inner coach with a kind of whistle or whatever it is, and then the inner child. Yeah. So we won't be able to go into it in detail here. I just want to invite you to think about it. Does your inner critic block you from accessing self-love? Does your inner coach want to encourage you to do self-love or access self-love? Is your inner child demanding, love, self-love, any kind of love is really needy and will take love from anybody or what they perceive to be love? So this is particularly in terms of codependent relationships. You may perceive, for example, if somebody is very generous or somebody is very controlling, you may perceive that that is an expression of love. Whereas actually, I would question that. Doesn't mean that it isn't love, but I would certainly check it out. Yeah. Often, well, it can be an example of codependent behavior. If people give you, for example, at the beginning of a relationship, they give you lots of presents. It's called love bombing. Yeah, if they're messaging you all the time, sending you cards, flowers, presents, that really sort of often overwhelming expression of what's culturally perceived of as love, but actually is quite an unhealthy way to communicate. And it's often the inner child that really, latches onto that. It's like, oh, somebody's giving me attention in a way that I've never experienced it before. So really be gentle with yourself. If you feel like your inner child is wanting to be in connection with maybe say a friend, and you know that that is not a healthy relationship for you, to go gently with yourself as you find your way through how you want to care for that relationship, either in terms of updating it or exiting it. And that kind of inner critic, remember, inner critic is a really vital part of your internal dialogue from a perspective of risk management. When the inner critic is really judgmental, actually, it really blocks your or affects your ability to access that self-love. So really do bear that in mind. And then the difference between self-compassion and self-love. So self-compassion really is that kindness, being able to speak softly, gently, encouragingly, really kind of embrace yourself. Yeah. So it's very much in that nurturing aspect, a nurturing sort of sphere of your self-experience. Whereas self-love, it can be all sorts of feelings. It's going on a date. It can be solo sex or sex with others. It can be treating yourself to gifts. It can be treating yourself to adventures. It can be, lots of things. So in a way, you could say self-compassion is like an aspect of self-love, but self-love has got much more to it. So I'm mindful of the time. Just want to mention that that we talk about that culturality there, remembering sort of what are your culture's beliefs around self-compassion and self-love. And then that kind of sun in the top corner there, the 24/7. And that kind of reminder that sun, whether you can see it or not, even on a cloudy day, the sun is still there. And I'd really like you to think of your ability to access self-love as your ability to access the sun. So notice I've always consistently throughout talked about the language of accessing self-love. And that's based on the assumption that self-love is there, you're just not able to access it. It's like you haven't got the Wi-Fi signal yet. Or it's been so cloudy, you haven't had a sunny day, you're not able to be in the warmth of the sun. So on that note, let's then move on to the next one, which is the first aid kit for self-love. I'd really encourage you to think about specific things to go in the first aid kit for self-love, like that salad bowl. So what she was going to do was take a photo of it, put the photo in the first aid kit. So when she was struggling, she just needs to go to the first aid kit as always, and there is the photo to remind her of one of the things that really gives her joy, love, everything in this really vibrant salad that she's making for herself. And then that cultivating self-love, watering the seeds. And notice the graphic there. That is, what's your story? That you can choose to go keep doing what you've always done, always do what you always get. The new choice is likely to have obstacles. That's somebody jumping over obstacles there. It takes watering seedlings, really nurturing that. It takes time to build a really strong and sort of glowing heart of self-love. And then remember my sort of attitude about the ripple effect. The ripple effect can be towards me, from me towards others, but also from one part of me towards other parts of me. Yeah, this is definitely a work in progress to integrate and align the different parts of you. So we're coming to the end of the recorded session, part of the session. So we encourage you to have a think about How do you know you can access self-love? What blocks you accessing it? What choice can you make into a habit that will support it? So if you come into the end of the video after the live event session itself, after the book club session itself, really take time to make note of these and make some notes, have a think, talk to friends, family, somebody you trust, get in touch if you're not part of this cohort, get in touch, or if you are part of this cohort, bring it up in the one-to-one that we'll do in 3 weeks' time. So just before I ask Zoe to end the recording, do as always go gently with yourself. Remember to go just steadfastly one step at a time. And this is a progress. You're on the journey. Sorry, this is a process, and you're on that journey. And I wish you well. Till next time, thank you. And if you could close the recording now, Zoe.